I'm Jerry Agar. Thanks for being with us here on Straight Talk. JJ McCullough joins me from Vancouver. JJ, welcome.
Thank you.
You got the 2015 election all figured out?
Hopefully.
Hopefully. They say that predicting an election is a fool's game.
Yeah, no, I mean, then normally I would say that is the case, although I do think that this election is much more likely to be a fairly conventional one, in contrast to, say, the 2011 election, which I think most people recognize was fairly cataclysmic, or we could say like the 1993 election, which was also quite cataclysmic. You know, those were elections that really sort of rejiggered the Canadian party system in quite profound ways, whereas I think that this 2015 election is much more likely to be much more low-key, much more conventional, and yield ultimately a much more conventional result.
Well, Michael Ignatieff went back to the United States with his tail between his legs, a spectacular failure as the leader of a party. Now comes young and attractive and charismatic Justin Trudeau, and he has lifted the party back up to, according to polls you and I were looking at yesterday from Angus Reid, pretty much a neck-and-neck tie with the Conservatives.
Yes, and that's what I mean in terms of a sort of revert to type, is that this is very much shaping up to be a very conventional liberal versus conservative election, with the sort of the NDP now being sort of seen as having an outlier effect. Actually, what I think the best analogy to describe sort of what the NDP was in 2011, which was very much a Quebec thing. And we know that Quebec basically hasn't helped elect a government in quite some time. I don't believe that Quebec has sent the majority of their seats to the winner of the election since, I believe, Mulroney in 1988. And so what's important to understand is that Quebec is sort of its own sort of idiosyncratic political place. And the fact that they liked the NDP so much in 2011, you know, was not much different than how they liked the Bloc Québécois in the 90s, how they used to like the Social Credit Party, if anybody's old enough to remember that. You know, they do their own thing. And I think that that's likely to be the case in this election, is that Quebec may very well still send the majority of its MPs from the NDP. But everywhere else in the country, when we look at the polls, yes, you're absolutely right. It is very much a Tory versus Liberal election.
Well, and in 2011, the Conservatives demonstrated that the NDP can have Quebec. The Conservatives don't need them.
Absolutely, because again, that's the point, right? Is that if Quebec can do whatever it wants, but unless somewhere else in the country is sort of playing that same game, it doesn't really matter. So unless somewhere else in the country is also sending a lot of NDP MPs to Ottawa, it doesn't really matter, because otherwise there's no hope for any NDP government, and otherwise Quebec is basically just wasting its votes because they're playing their own little idiosyncratic game that is not being echoed anywhere else in the country. It is not obvious at all where the NDP's sort of second half of their electoral coalition is supposed to come from.
Well, people like me look at all the gaffes that we've seen from Justin Trudeau and report gleefully on them, and I admit that that's partly because I don't want him to succeed. But do you think that you could see in this 2015 election at least a Liberal minority government?
I think it's possible. I think that when you look at the polls, you definitely see that. You see a sort of neck-and-neck race between, again, the Liberals, who have been very successful under Justin Trudeau, and at least in terms of rising back into second place in the popular consciousness, and, you know, the Conservatives. For all the Conservatives' troubles in the polls, they still are the incumbent party, and incumbency is an enormous advantage in Canadian elections to a degree that is often not really, respected, I think, enough in sort of the popular press and pundits like myself. I mean, incumbent MPs tend to get elected by rates of 70, 80%, and the fact that the Conservatives have the most seats in Parliament right now and are not seeing a great number of their MPs retire means that they're at a tremendous numbers advantage just out of the gate. I mean, I was sort of trying to crunch some of the numbers myself, and it seems like there's about 80 safe Conservative seats just by virtue of incumbency and by virtue of standard rates of decay and standard rates of retirement and that kind of thing. So that does put them at much more of a formidable position than I think some acknowledge, and does sort of state that as much as national polls reflect the national mood, it is ultimately an election of, what is it now, 338 individual ridings.
Well, the Conservatives came forth with a plan to put more money in your pocket indirectly through tax changes and directly for people with children in increased payments for having those children in your home. Initially, Justin Trudeau came out against all of it, it seemed. Then he just concentrated on the income splitting and tried to say that that's just something for rich people. But it strikes me that that's a pretty good chess move if you just look at this coldly as a political thing by the Conservatives, because this election is going to happen right about the time those checks start arriving. And if Thomas Mulcair and Justin Trudeau want to say they'd take those checks away from Canadian families, I'm sure that the Prime Minister would be happy to have them say so.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. And I mean, these are the kind of issues that elections are ultimately fought over. I mean, over the last couple of months, or if not the last year, we've talked about a lot of issues that are quite tertiary, but are very popular in the national news media. You know, we've talked about foreign policy a lot, about Harper's position on Ukraine or Israel. You know, we've talked a lot about Justin Trudeau's positions on social issues, on marijuana, you know, prostitution, abortion. Ultimately, those things are fun to discuss, but at the end of the day, Canadian voters tend to vote on issues that are, you know, quite quote-unquote boring, which are generally pocketbook issues, issues of finance, issues of who do they think is going to hurt their bottom line, who's going to hurt their ability to put bread on the table, who's going to raise taxes, who's going to lower taxes. You know, these kinds of issues are ultimately ones that decide the election, and I think that as we get closer to election time, you're going to see a much more hunkering down on these kind of pocketbook issues and away from some of these distractions.
Well, we've got Justin Trudeau, who is young and charismatic. We've got Thomas Mulcair, who is fiery and in your face some of the time. And then we've got Stephen Harper plodding along, kind of boring. And the economy, according to other countries, is a really, really good one in Canada. The banks are solvent and safe. We weathered the recession better than many, perhaps almost all countries. And so perhaps steady as it goes could win the day.
Yes, no, very much so. I mean, you have to look at when other prime ministers have lost elections or when they've sort of been forced into retirement. You look at Prime Minister Mulroney, you look at Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau. I mean, they were enormously popular, or unpopular by the end of their reign. I mean, just Prime Minister Mulroney, I mean, his approval was like, what, in the single digits, I believe, when he ended up shuffling off. Prime Minister Harper, for as much as, you know, the left despises him, and frankly, as bad as his approval ratings are, they're not radioactive. He is not a enormously detested man. And nor should he be, because as you accurately proved, just stated, you know, things in Canada are not ultimately that bad. You know, the mood of the country, I think, is generally quite positive. And I think that that ultimately becomes a very tremendous advantage to the Prime Minister's re-election bid, because ultimately, you know, Canadians are a very cautious people, a very conservative people in a very instinctive sense. You know, we saw this with the re-election of Premier Wynne, oddly enough, is that people really tend to fear change. People tend to fear candidates that seem untested, unpredictable. And I think in the same way that Premier Wynne was able to frame, you know, Mr. Hudak that way, the way that the Liberals in my province were able to frame the NDP, you know, the way that Mr. Tory in Toronto was able to frame Olivia Chow, you know, these kind of marketing of the opposition as untested in, you know, people that could possibly upset the apple cart of a good, steady, stable time, I think is a tremendously effective pitch, and one that will be very effective against Justin Trudeau, ultimately.
Well, people, I think, in Ontario, to use your example there, are tired of the Liberals. 62% didn't vote for them, but enough did that they achieved their majority. I think it was there to take for the Conservatives, but then the leader blurted out that he was going to get rid of 100,000 civil servants, and a million or so people heard he's going to get rid of my job, and that's seen as one of the reasons he lost the election. The other two parties can't count on Stephen Harper saying something dumb at the last minute.
No, but they can perhaps count on Justin Trudeau saying something dumb at the last minute. And it will be interesting to see, for instance, because you know, the Liberal Party has embarked upon this very deliberate strategy to keep Justin Trudeau in as much of a bubble as possible. We may recall that when he first became leader, he said, I'm not going to talk about policy until the election. And that's been fine. I mean, that I think has explained why he's been as popular as he is, because he's kind of been this Obama-like blank slate that people just project their hopes and dreams onto. But in the context of the election, in which he can't hide from reporters, in which he has to answer questions, in which he'll frankly have to answer the tough questions of Prime Minister Harper and Mr. Mulcair on the debate stage, I mean, the chances for some sort of meltdown, I think, are quite high, and that's what I'm going to be quite eagerly looking for.
I appreciate your time, and Happy New Year. Talk to you very soon, I'm sure.
Happy New Year to you, sir.